He asked for a quiet, capable wife. The woman who stepped off the train had other plans. I have told this story more times than I can count, and it gets better every time I tell it, mostly because I always forget to mention that I almost sent her home. That is the part I leave out when I am feeling proud of myself. The part where I stood on the platform at Saddler's Creek in August heat that would have cracked a stone in two, looked at the woman stepping off the noon train and thought, "This is a mistake, and I have made it, and the question now is how to correct it before it goes any further." I did not correct it. I want to say I was wise enough to see what was in front of me, but the truth is I was too stubborn to admit I had made the wrong call, and that stubbornness bought me enough time to be educated out of being wrong. That is not a flattering story, but it is the accurate one, and Vera, if she were here, would correct me if I told it any other way. She always corrects me. It is one of her habits that I have come to regard as a gift, though it took me some time to get there. Let me start at the beginning. My name is Cord Halstead. I run cattle on 1,200 acres south of the Harlan Flats, land my father broke when I was 7 years old, and that I have kept whole through 2 droughts, one bad winter, one summer when the creek dropped so low we were hauling water by wagon for 6 weeks, and a year that took my wife and 30 head of cattle and left me alone in a house that was too large and too quiet in equal measure. Eleanor died in February, a lung fever that came on fast and did not relent. By the time spring came, I was managing the ranch and managing the silence both, and I had gotten tolerably good at the ranch and not good at all at the silence. That was 2 years before this story begins. By the time I placed the advertisement, I had run the Halstead Ranch alone long enough to understand the difference between what a man thinks he needs and what he actually needs. What I thought I needed was a capable partner for the practical work of the ranch, someone who could keep the house accounts, manage the cook when the cook needed managing, and not fill every quiet moment with conversation I did not have the energy for. I had been running the ranch by ledger and list for 2 years. I wanted a wife who understood ledgers. I was 38 years old and I had no interest in starting anything complicated. I wrote the advertisement myself. I spent 3 evenings on it, which is longer than I had spent on most things in my life, and the result was this. Rancher, 38, 1,200 acres on the Harlan Flats, seeks capable, practical woman, comfortable with hard work, preferably quiet in the mornings. I am not a man who wastes words. I sent it to 3 papers and received 11 replies over the following weeks. 10 of them I set aside. 1, from a Miss Vera Calloway of Millhaven, written in a hand so precise it looked machine-printed, I read 4 times before I wrote back. Her letter was practical in a way that I appreciated immediately. She listed her capabilities without embellishment: household accounts, preserving, some experience with livestock, baking. She said she was 34 years old, in good health, and accustomed to early mornings. She asked 2 questions. The first was the elevation of the Harlan Flats, as she had a minor consideration with her lungs in high altitude. The second was this: what do you mean by preferably quiet in the mornings? I want to understand whether this is a requirement or a preference, as they are not the same thing. That second question should have told me everything I needed to know about Vera Calloway. I have thought about it since, and I believe the honest answer is that it did tell me, and that I ignored it, because a man who has written preferably quiet wants to believe he will get preferably quiet, and so he reads what he wants to read. I wrote back that it was a preference, not a requirement. She wrote back that she would be on the August 14th train out of Millhaven. No elaboration. I respected the economy of it. What I failed to appreciate was that a precise letter is not evidence of a quiet nature. It is evidence of a precise nature, which is a different thing altogether. The train came into Saddler's Creek at 12:15 on a Thursday afternoon, so hot the air above the tracks had a shimmer to it like moving water. I had driven in from the ranch that morning, handled my business at the grain merchants and the post office, and was standing at the far end of the platform when the noon train pulled in. It was not a long platform. The town of Saddler's Creek was not a large town. A general store, a livery, a small hotel, a church whose paint had been peeling since before I was born, and the grain merchants where I did most of my business. I knew everyone in it. I had lived south of it my whole life. People came off the train. A family with too much luggage. A man I recognized from one of the outlying ranches. Two women together who appeared to be sisters. And then, from the second car, a woman came down the steps carrying a carpet bag and directing a porter behind her with a traveling trunk that was, I noted, very large for someone coming to a cattle ranch. The trunk alone told a story, and the story was that the woman who owned it had not yet entirely settled in her mind what this arrangement was going to require of her, or else she had decided to be prepared for any number of possible versions of it. She cleared the bottom step and was already talking to the porter. I could see it from where I stood. She was explaining something, and the porter was nodding the way a man nods when he has decided that agreement is a faster road than argument. She handed him something, a coin, probably, and turned to look at the platform. Her eyes found me across the distance. There was no hesitation. She walked toward me at a pace that was direct without being rushed, like a woman who has a destination and has already figured out the most efficient route to it. She said, "Your house dead." I said, "I am." She said, "Your letter had 3 comma splices. I didn't mention it in my reply because it seemed forward, but I wanted you to know I noticed." I stood there for a moment in the August heat. I said, "How was the train?" She said, "Long. The biscuits at the junction stop were an insult to wheat flour." She looked past me toward the wagon. "Is that yours?" "It is." "Good. I'd like to get out to the ranch before dark. I don't sleep well in a new place on the first night, and I want as much daylight as possible to understand the layout before I have to navigate it in the dark." She walked to the wagon. She did not wait to be helped up, though I came around to assist. She was already seated by the time I reached her side. I went and lifted her trunk into the wagon bed, and I will say honestly that it weighed considerably more than I had anticipated. I drove her out to the Halstead Ranch in what was technically silence, which is what I had asked for, and so I should not have been unsettled by it. The trouble was that the silence did not feel like her natural condition. It felt like the silence of a person who is busy doing something, looking, in her case. She looked at everything we passed. The condition of the fence lines, the grass coverage in the visible pastures, the number of cattle I had in the near range, the state of the creek crossing where the road dipped down through a dry gulch. Twice she raised her hand and pointed at something without speaking. Once at a section of split trail that had leaned off its post on the south side of the road. Once at the windmill in the eastern pasture that I had been meaning to look at for the better part of a month. She pointed as if she were making a list in her head and adding items to it. I said, "You can ask questions if you have them." She said, "I'm not ready to ask questions yet. I'm still looking." I told myself that I would give it 2 weeks. If she could not adapt to the ranch by then, I would put her on the train back to Millhaven with my apologies and the cost of the fare, and I would write a better advertisement. That was the plan I had when I pulled into the Halstead yard on the afternoon of August 14th. I had it for approximately 48 hours. My 2 hands were Dub Pierce, who was 47 and had been working for my father before he worked for me, and a younger man called Fen Alcott, who had come on 2 springs prior, and was shaping up into a decent hand in the way that some young men do when they are put to work they actually understand. They were both standing near the barn when the wagon came in, because neither of them had been entirely subtle about their interest in the mail-order situation. Dub had made his views known privately. He thought the whole business was a bad idea, but that if I was going to do it, I should do it, and he would keep his opinions afterward to himself for as long as he could manage it, which in Dub's case was never very long. Fen had been more openly curious, with the curiosity of a young man who finds the whole enterprise of grown adults arranging marriages through letters somewhat remarkable. I introduced them. Vera shook their hands with the kind of directness that makes some people comfortable and other people less so. Dub fell into the second category, though he managed. She asked to see the house first, then the outbuildings, then the pasture access points. I walked her through. She did not say much. She was still in the looking phase, but she asked two specific questions. One about where the water was drawn from in winter when the creek froze, and one about the root cellar access. That second question told me something about her thinking that I filed away and thought about later. We ate supper that evening with Dub and Finn at the kitchen table, which was how the ranch had always done it. Prentice cooked. Salt pork and biscuits and boiled turnips, nothing remarkable. Vera ate without comment on the food, though I noticed her look at the biscuits in a particular way that I did not at the time know how to interpret. She talked to Finn about his family's farm in some valley I had not heard of, and listened to what he said with what appeared to be genuine attention. Dub was mostly quiet. I was mostly quiet. After supper she said she was going to sleep, and she thanked Prentice for the meal and went upstairs. Dub and I sat for a minute after she was gone. He said, "She seems capable." I said, "She appears to be." He said, "You said preferably quiet in the mornings." I said, "I know what I said." He looked at his coffee. He said, 2 weeks. That was his bet, privately and to himself, 2 weeks. On the second morning Vera came downstairs at 5:30, which was earlier than I had expected and earlier than she needed to. I was at the table with the account ledger, which I generally went through in the morning when I had the quiet to think. She poured coffee and sat down across from me and looked at the ledger. She said, "May I?" I said, "It's the supply ledger." She said, "I know, may I look at it?" I did not see a reason to say no. I pushed it across the table. She looked at it for approximately 20 minutes while I drank my coffee and watched her, which was a thing I found myself doing without having decided to, watching her read, watching her finger trace a column, watching the small, precise movements of a person who reads numbers the way some people read maps, looking for the shape of the territory. She said, "You've been overpaying the grain merchant." I said, "Which merchant?" She said, "Saddler's Creek, 11 cents per bushel since January. It may be a calculation error, it may not. I would like to write a letter." She looked up. "I'll leave it on your desk for you to sign or not sign." I said, "You found that in 20 minutes. She said, "I've been doing accounts since I was 12. The error isn't large, but it's consistent, which means it's either systematic or intentional. Either way, it needs addressing." She put the ledger back where I had it and drank her coffee. Then she said, "The biscuits last night were oversalted." I said, "Prentice has made those biscuits for 15 years. She said, "Then he has been oversalting them for 15 years. I'll talk to him this morning." She did. I heard the conversation from the barn, not the words, but the tenor of it. Vera's voice even and steady, Prentice's voice progressing through several phases of response. I found Prentice afterward at the stove in the cook shack, with the expression of a man who has argued and then conceded, and who is still calculating how he feels about that. He said, "She changed my biscuits." I said, "Did she ruin them?" He paused for long enough that the pause itself was an answer. He said, "No, they're correct now, but they were my biscuits." I signed the letter to the grain merchant. He wrote back 2 weeks later with what he called a correction and what I understood to be a concession, and enclosed a bank draft for $63 and some change. Vera put it in the correct column of the ledger without ceremony. Dub revised his estimate privately, but did not acknowledge doing so. The first serious point of collision between Vera and myself came at the end of the second week. I have mentioned that I ran the ranch by list. Each evening I wrote the next day's tasks in order of priority and executed them in that order. It was a system that had worked without adjustment for 9 years, and I saw no reason to adjust it. Vera came to breakfast on a Tuesday and said she wanted to reorganize the root cellar. She had determined, she explained, that the current organization was based on chronological order of acquisition, which meant that frequently used items were not where they should be relative to frequency of use, and this was creating inefficiency. She wanted the morning, and she wanted Fen to help with the heavy items. Fen was on my morning list for the north fence and the check of the northeast water tank. I said, Fen is on the north line this morning. She said, that runs 2 hours at most. He can do it after. I said, the list is in a particular order for a reason. She said, what reason? I looked at her. I said, that is how the ranch runs. She looked back at me with the patient attention of a person who has asked a specific question and has not yet received an answer to it. She said, I understand it's the order you've established. What I'm asking is, what happens to the cattle if the north tank check happens at 10 instead of 7? I said, nothing happens to the cattle. She said, then the list order on this particular Tuesday can accommodate the root cellar in the morning. I said, it does not accommodate it. The list exists so I know what order things happen in. She said, and if you know that on this Tuesday the root cellar happens in the morning and the north tank happens at 10, the list still tells you that. The order is different. The clarity is the same. There was a silence. I said, I will give you Fen from 7 to 9. He does the north tank at 9. She said, thank you. And she got up and began clearing the breakfast dishes with the efficiency of a person who has concluded the conversation. I told myself, walking out to the barn, that I had made a reasonable accommodation, and that was the end of it. The root cellar was reorganized by noon. When I went down there 3 days later to locate a jar of preserved apples, I found what I was looking for in less than half the time it had previously taken me. I made a note of this fact in my head and did not mention it to Vera, because I was not yet ready to be reasonable about it. The bunkhouse roof happened 2 weeks after the root cellar. I had known the east section of the bunkhouse roof needed attention. I had been aware of it since early summer. I had put it on my list for late autumn, reasoning that if it had held this long it would hold another season. Dub had made the same assessment, which is probably why neither of us pushed it. Vera asked about the roof one morning. I said it was on the list for late autumn. She said, what is the current condition of the east section? I said, needs some work. She said, has anyone looked at it recently? I said, Dub looked at it in June. She said, from the ground or from up top? I said, from the ground. She said, that is not a roof inspection. The following morning she was on the bunkhouse roof. Dub came to find me in the barn with the expression of a man who has witnessed something he needs to process with another person. He said, Miss Calloway is on the roof. I said, I know. He said, she went up on the ladder from the west side. I asked her what she was doing, and she said she was inspecting the east section. I said, is she still up there? He said, she is. She is walking around on it. I said, is she in danger? He considered this. He said, no, she appears to know where to step. I went to the bunkhouse. Vera was on the roof, moving carefully along the east section with the focus of a person who is reading something written in the surface beneath her feet. She crouched down in one spot, ran her hand over the roofing material, stood again. She came down the ladder in the same unhurried way she did most things. She said, the east section needs to come off and be relaid before October. There are 3 spots where the water is already working through. If you wait another season, you'll have it in the walls. Dub said, Miss Calloway, that roof has. She said, been there a long time, I know. The age is part of the problem. She looked at me. I can work up a materials estimate if you want to take it to the lumber yard in town. It's better done now. I said, work up the estimate. Dub and I looked at each other when she had gone inside. He said, she went on the roof. I said, the roof needed inspection. He said, cord. I have worked on this ranch since before you owned it. In all that time, no one has gone on the bunkhouse roof without being asked to go on it. I said, is she wrong about the east section? A pause, he said, "No. She is not wrong." He picked up the water bucket he had set down when he came to get me. "I had her at 2 weeks." I said, "You were wrong." He said, "I was wrong about the roof too." He went back to work. The bunkhouse roof was relaid in late September. The materials cost came in $14 under Vera's estimate, which she noted in the ledger under the actual cost, and put her estimate beside it in small figures with what I recognized as the smallest possible indication of satisfaction. The calf came at the end of September. A heifer calf born weak in the early morning from a cow who had had trouble before, and who, by the time I found the pair, had turned away from the newborn in the particular way that sometimes happens with difficult births. Dub looked the calf over and said, "Probably not make it." The calf was cold and its breathing was not right. I was considering agreeing with him. Vera came across the yard from the house, seeing the situation from a distance the way she saw most things, ahead of when other people would notice. She did not ask permission. She knelt in the straw beside the calf and ran her hands over it with the attention of someone who has done this before. She said, "She's cold, but she's alive. I need a blanket and a bucket and the other cow's milk if you can get it." Dub said, "Miss Calloway, the mother has already." She said, "I know what the mother has done. Bucket and blanket, please." She said it the same way she said most things. Not loud, not hard, simply as if the next step were clear and she expected the people around her to proceed to it. Dub looked at me. I nodded. We got her the bucket and the blanket. She worked on that calf for the better part of 4 hours. She warmed it and fed it by hand with a rag soaked in milk from a neighboring cow, talking to it in a low, steady voice the whole time, and when it wanted to go down she kept it on its feet, and when Fen offered to spell her she said, "I'm all right. Keep watching the time." By noon the calf was standing. Unsteady, small, not certain yet of its position in the world, but standing. Vera stood up. She brushed the straw from her skirt and looked at the calf without any particular expression on her face. Then she said, "She'll need watching for the next few days. Someone should check on her every few hours." I said, "We'll make sure of it." She nodded. She went back to the house. Dub and I stood in the barn door and watched the calf take 2 experimental steps on its thin legs. Dub said, "She's done that before." I said, "Her father's farm." He said, "The calf would have died." I said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I had her at 2 weeks." I said, "You've said." He said slowly, as if working through a calculation, "I was wrong about the calf. I was wrong about the roof. I was wrong about the root cellar." He looked at me sideways. "How long are you going to take to work out what I've already worked out?" I said, "Mind your business, Dub." He said, "I am minding it, Cord. This is my business." And he picked up his hat and went back to work. The evenings had changed sometime in the 3rd week. I do not know the exact moment it happened, only that by mid-September I was staying at the kitchen table after supper longer than I had any particular reason to. And the reason I was staying was sitting across the table with her ledger or her mending, or a book she had brought from Millhaven in that large trunk, and the lamp made a warm circle between us. She talked if she had something to say, which was most evenings, and she did not talk when she did not, and the combination was one I had not known until I had it that I missed. Eleanor had been quiet in the evenings as in the mornings, a comfortable quiet that I had loved, and that I had been missing for 2 years without being able to name what I was missing. This was different. This was the quiet of a person who has already said something and is thinking about the next thing, and who will say it when it is ready. She told me about Millhaven and her family's farm. She was the 3rd of 5 children. Her father had run a mixed farm, cattle and grain, some hogs, and they had all worked it from the time they were old enough to follow instructions. She had taught school for 4 years, which had given her patience with people who needed things explained more than once, and which had also given her, she said, A very clear sense of which explanations were the problem and which people were the problem, and how to tell the difference. She had been engaged once. A man who had decided to go west. He had gone and he had not sent for her as he had said he would, and after 2 years of waiting she had understood that he was not going to. I said, "Do you regret waiting?" She said, "I spent a year regretting it. Then I decided that a man who does not send for you is not a man worth regretting, and I stopped." She was quiet for a moment. "You." I knew what she was asking. I said, "Elena, 2 years ago, winter fever." She said, "I'm sorry." What was she like? It was not the question I had expected. Most people said "I'm sorry" and then changed the subject, which was what I generally preferred. I said, "She was steady. She was the kind of person who knew her mind and did not need much noise around her. She was good at being still." Vera said, "She sounds like the opposite of me." I said, "She was quiet in the mornings." She looked at me across the lamp, and there was a quality in her expression that was both amusement and something else, something more careful. She said, "I'm not going to apologize for that." I said, "I'm not asking you to. I'm saying she was and you are not, and I have noticed the difference." "Is it a complaint?" she said. I thought about it honestly and said, "No." She held my gaze for a moment and then went back to her mending, and neither of us said anything more about it. But the silence after was different from the silence before. Autumn came on fast the way it does on the Harlan Flats. You get 2 weeks of turning weather, the cottonwoods going gold along the creek, the air carrying a different weight in the mornings, and then the cold comes in from the north and settles like it owns the place. The pastures went pale, and the horses thickened their coats, and the ranch began the long business of putting itself in order for winter. I was putting myself in order too, in the way that is harder to do because it requires knowing what you are ordering. I had been aware since sometime in September of a thing I was not yet prepared to name directly. I was looking for Vera when she was not in the room. Not urgently, not obviously, but I was aware of where she was and whether she was inside or outside and whether I had seen her that morning and whether the kitchen lamp was lit, which meant she was still up, which meant if I went in from the barn I would find her at the table. A man who lives alone for 2 years does not notice these things about himself until there is something to notice them about. Then he notices all at once. What I was working up to was a conversation I had not yet figured out how to start. Vera was not a woman who made things convenient by broadcasting her feelings before she had decided what they were. She was precise about everything, including herself, and I did not know I had looked for evidence, the way I would look for evidence in a ledger, and found nothing definitive. What she felt about the Halstead Ranch, about the winter that was coming, about the arrangement she had entered into when she got off that train in August. Birch Tully came by on a Friday in early October. Birch was 29, the son of Garrett Tully, who ran the neighboring spread to the northeast. He was a reasonable man's son who had grown up around cattle and who would, in a few years, inherit a solid piece of ground. He came on the pretext of a fence line question, which was not an unreasonable pretext. Our east boundary and his father's west boundary shared a section I had been meaning to ride with someone from the Tully Ranch for the better part of a season. I answered the fence question, and then he stayed on my porch considerably longer than the fence question required, and I noticed that he was watching the kitchen window. He said, "That your Maylord or woman? I'd heard she was helping you with the accounts." I said, "Miss Calloway manages the ranch accounts." He said, "She settled in well then." I said, "She has." He said, "I might call on her sometime, if that would be all right with you." I said, "She's a grown woman. She makes her own choices." He nodded and left. I stood on the porch in the October cold and watched him ride out, and I will say plainly that I did not feel nothing during that conversation, because I felt something that had a specific quality to it. The quality of a man who has been taking his time arriving at a conclusion and has just understood that time, is something he does not have unlimited amounts of. I did not sleep well that Friday. On Tuesday, Birch Tully called. I was in the barn when he arrived at the yard, and I stayed in the barn for the length of time that I estimated was appropriate for a social call, and then I came out and walked to the house. His horse was gone from the yard. Vera was at the kitchen table with the ledger open. I said, "How was the call?" She said, "Pleasant enough." She did not look up. I said, "He is a decent man. His ranch will be in good order when he inherits." She said, I said, "He has a good reputation in the county." She said, "So I understand." I sat down at the table. I said, "Vera." She looked up. I said, "I wrote that advertisement to say what I thought I needed. A quiet woman who could do accounts and not ask me too many questions. I had it in my mind very precisely, a particular kind of arrangement." She waited. I said, "You are not what I put in the advertisement." She said, "I know that." I said, "You corrected my grammar in the first 5 minutes." She said, "Your comma splices were." "You reorganized the root cellar," I said. "You argued with Prentice about the biscuits until the biscuits were right. You went on the bunkhouse roof when nobody asked you to. You spent 4 hours on a calf that Dub had given up on and I had considered giving up on." I paused. "You have not been quiet in the mornings." She said, "I warned you." "You did," I said. "You asked whether it was a requirement or a preference, and I said a preference, and what I did not understand when I said it was that what I actually wanted was not quiet. I wanted a person in the room. I had convinced myself I wanted quiet because I had had quiet, and it was easier to want the version of a thing I already understood." I looked at her across the table. What I needed was someone who would go on the roof when the roof needed inspection. I needed the grain merchant's error caught. I needed the calf. I stopped. I said, "I needed you. This particular woman who got off this particular train, not the woman I described in the advertisement." She held my gaze. She said, "Cord, I didn't accept Birch Tully's invitation." I said, "What invitation?" She said, "Sunday supper at the Tully Ranch," he asked. She looked at me steadily. I said no. I said I had obligations here. A pause. "That is not the only reason I said no, but it was the reason I gave him." I said, "What was the other reason?" She said, "I imagine you can work it out." I said, "I'd rather you tell me." She set down the pen she had been holding and folded her hands on the ledger in the precise way she had of settling herself before she said something she had thought through. She said, "I came off that train in August expecting a practical arrangement, a rancher who needed accounts managed and a house kept and someone to make the work of the place more efficient. That is what I thought it was." She looked at me. It became something else. It became a table with a lamp on it in the evenings. It became a calf we saved together. It became you not saying anything when I reorganized the root cellar except giving me Finn for 2 hours. Those are not nothing, Cord. To me, those are not nothing. I said no. She said, "I have been here since August and I have not wanted to be anywhere else. I have thought about that. I don't make decisions without thinking about them." She tilted her head slightly. "You are a man who arrives at conclusions by his own road. I have been patient about this road, but I want to be clear that I have not been sitting here waiting for Birch Tully to make up your mind for you. I was going to give you until November and then have this conversation myself." I said, "It is October." She said, "You made good time." I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held mine, her grip the same way she did everything, direct and certain, not hard. The lamp between us made the same warm circle it always made. I said, "I would like to ask you to marry me." She said, "I would like you to ask me." "Vera Calloway," I said, "will you marry me?" She said, "Yes." And then, after a moment, "I will plan the ceremony. You won't have to think about most of it. I will bring you a list of decisions that actually require your input." I said, "I generally have a list." She said, "You may contribute to the list. We will reconcile them." I said, "What if they don't reconcile?" She said, "I will tell you why mine is correct and you will be persuaded, because on matters of ceremony, you don't actually have strong opinions. You have opinions about cattle and fence lines and account ledgers. The ceremony is mine." I considered this. I said, "You have already planned it." She said, "I have thought about it, in general terms." "Since when?" She said, "Since about the third week of September." She looked at me with what I had come to recognize as the version of her expression that contained both amusement and complete seriousness at the same time. "Cord, you were looking for me when I wasn't in the room. I noticed." I said, "I was not looking for." "You were looking for me," she said. "You are a precise man. When you came in from the barn at night, you looked to see if the kitchen light was on. When you came to breakfast, you looked to see if I was already at the table. I am a person who notices things. It is one of my habits." I said, "Is it?" She said, "It is. You'll get used to it." She was right, I did. We were married on the third Saturday of November at the Saddler's Creek Church by the circuit preacher, a broad-shouldered man named Aldous who came through every 6 weeks and conducted marriages and funerals and services with equal plain-spoken efficiency. Vera had negotiated the date with his schedule. She had also arranged for the church to be swept, the flowers to be what could be found in November, which was mostly dried things and some green, and the supper afterward at the hotel dining room with enough people invited to fill one long table. Dub and Fenn stood as witnesses. Prentice came and stood in the back and cried quietly and without apparent embarrassment when we said the words, which was something none of us had anticipated, and which Fenn handled by looking at the ceiling and Dub handled by looking at his boots. I held Vera's hands, which were warm and steady, and I said the words, and she said the words, and the preacher Vera corrected him once on a pronoun during the vows. A small correction, said quietly, and he received it with the grace of a man who has learned that some corrections come from people who simply cannot help being accurate, pronounced us married. Dub paid Fenn his bet eventually, though the terms had been renegotiated considerably over the preceding months, and Fenn accepted the revised terms with the generosity of someone who had won more than he had lost. The ranch ran better after Vera and I were married, in the sense that it ran better than it had even in the months before the wedding. The accounts were kept with a precision that had not existed before August of that year. The supply arrangements were tighter. The grain merchant in Saddler's Creek was under the impression, not incorrect, that Halstead Ranch accounts were now maintained by someone who would notice any irregularity and address it directly. The bunkhouse roof did not leak when the winter snow came, which Dub acknowledged by saying nothing and fixing his coffee in the morning, with an expression of quiet vindication that was not aimed at anyone and did not need to be. The calf grew. Vera named her Penny for the 11 cents per bushel, and while I had never been in the habit of naming cattle beyond the basic useful designations, I found I did not object. Penny was Vera's calf, and she had earned her name honestly. Winter came in hard that year, the way it sometimes does on the Harlan Flats, the cold coming in a week before it was expected and settling. We had prepared for it, the root cellar organized and stocked, the bunkhouse repaired, the hay stores where they needed to be, the water situation managed. On the first bad night when the temperature dropped and the wind came up from the north, we were all inside, Dub and Fenn in the bunkhouse, Prentice in the cook's shack, Vera and me in the house. We sat at the kitchen table that night after supper with the fire going. Vera had her ledger. I had a letter I needed to write to a buyer in the eastern county about the spring sale. The wind picked up outside and the lamp made its circle on the table, and we were both working and neither of us needed to speak, and we didn't. After a while she said, "South pasture rotation in spring. I've been thinking about the coverage. I want to show you the numbers." I said, "In the morning." She said, "In the morning." She closed the ledger. "The numbers are good." We'll do better this year. I said we will. Outside the wind pressed against the house and the cold held the world still, and inside the lamp burned, and the fire settled, and my wife sat across from me at the same table where we had sat every evening since August, the table that had in some way been the whole story without my knowing it, two people with their work, a lamp between them, the quiet that is not an absence of something but the presence of enough. I had written the advertisement to a man's idea of what he needed, a practical woman, quiet in the mornings, no fuss. I had gotten Vera Calloway, who was precise and capable, and went on the roof when the roof needed inspection, and corrected my comma splices before she had cleared the bottom step of the train car, who saved the calf and fixed the biscuits and found the error in the grain ledger, and who had, by the 3rd week of September, already decided what this was going to become, while I was still making my slow way down my own road toward the same conclusion. She told me once, later, that she had known that a man who writes preferably quiet in the mornings is not a man who wants quiet. He is a man who wants something he has not yet found words for, and the preferably is the tell. You do not put preferably in an advertisement for something you actually require. You put it for something you think you want, which is different. I asked her when she had decided. She said, "When I read your letter, the comma splices told me you wrote it carefully and didn't check it, which meant you were nervous, which meant it mattered to you more than you were letting on. That's worth a train ticket." I said, "You took a train out to the Harlan Flats because I was nervous about comma splices." She said, "I took a train because a man who is precise about cattle and accounts and list order but lets comma splices through is a man whose precision covers something else. I wanted to know what it covered." I said, "And what did it cover?" She said, "This. All of this." She gestured, not at anything in particular, at the table, the room, the window, the ranch beyond it. A man who wanted a home again and didn't know how to say so. I thought about arguing with that. I thought about the advertisement and the list and the way I had stood on the platform at Saddler's Creek and considered putting her back on the train. I thought about the root cellar and the biscuits and the calf and the bunkhouse roof and the evenings with the lamp and the moment I reached across the table and she turned her hand over and held mine. I said, "You were right." She said, "I know," and she went back to her ledger. Outside, the Harlan Flats lay quiet under the November cold, the cattle settled in the south pasture, the windmill turning slow in a wind that had gone easy for the night. The fire in the grate put its warmth into the room. My wife sat across from me and worked, and I worked, and the lamp burned between us, and the house that had been too large and too quiet for 2 years was neither of those things anymore. That was how it was, that was all of it. I had asked for a quiet, sensible woman, and I had gotten the wrong thing entirely, and it was the best mistake I ever made, and I have never once been sorry for it, not even on the mornings, especially not on the mornings, when she corrects my grammar before the coffee is done.